Hello, everybody. Good evening. I hope everyone is having a very good and relaxing Saturday night. Figured I would hop on here, do a little bit of a stream about today's events, and have myself a drink. It's kind of my Saturday routine at this point. We'll give everyone a few minutes to come in if there's anyone available tonight. Not sure. I didn't really give much of a heads up of the stream. Been pretty busy throughout the day. Took my daughter out sled riding for a while. We got a decent amount of snow here over the last few days. It's still pretty cold too, so it's not melting. So it's ideal sled riding weather. I think in the stream I'm mainly going to talk about the raid on Venezuela, the capture of Maduro, and why this raid actually took place, and I guess how it fits into the United States' regional strategy within the Americas. Now that the United States is generally not focused on being a hegemon anymore, that this was the next logical step, that the United States is going to focus solely on its direct sphere of influence. Well, not solely, entirely. I think the United States is still going to have its footprint around the world, but not to the degree that it once had. I think most of our strategic focus will be within the Americas, kind of as it once was before World War I. I think that's where the United States, most of our strategic interest actually lies. Now, quite a few people out there that are upset about what happened, which I understand. There's quite a few people that are proponents of international law. Again, something that I understand. I'm sympathetic to. I get it. It would be nice to have a general set of laws and guidelines and rules that nations could follow when interacting with one another to ensure that nations aren't being used, abused, exploited, or destroyed for the benefit of others. That sounds good. It really does. And I think that was the purpose of the UN. But also, too, let's be honest here, the world's great powers generally do what they want when they want, and they're always going to do what they want when they want, regardless of what the UN says. And I think as the world moves towards multipolarity and away from US hegemony, I think that's going to become more and more apparent. I think it's going to end up becoming like an age of great powers once more. And I've mentioned this plenty of times, but it's mainly the United States, China, and Russia, which I'd say the United States, out of the three, currently being technically the most powerful, with China in a very close second, and Russia, and I would say not a distant third, but it's definitely the weaker out of the three. So let's talk about this raid on Venezuela. I was as shocked as I'm sure everybody else was. I actually had woken up at 4 a.m. to use the bathroom, and I made the mistake of, looking at my phone, knowing that, I'm probably going to see something that's going to keep me awake. I'm probably going to doom scroll for the next half an hour until I fall back to sleep. And the very first thing I saw was U.S. strikes Venezuela. I'm like, I'm not going back to bed. So I stayed up for about an hour, looking into what was actually happening, scrolling through X, looking at the different pages that I follow, trying to get as much information as I could. And it was pretty apparent. I heard rumors very early on that Maduro had been captured and that the raid was largely unopposed. But I figured, okay, I should probably at least get some sleep. I have to be up at 7 o'clock in the morning with my oldest daughter because she always wakes up early. She does not like to sleep in and has a natural alarm clock for 7. So I was going to wake up with her when my wife slept in with the youngest. But so I woke up, I looked at Twitter again, and I saw that Maduro had been captured. The raid was relatively bloodless and on very, very smoothly. And thankfully for President Trump and political future, it could have gone the other way, and that would have hurt Trump. I think very badly. I think this was a pretty big political risk for him to take, given the fact that his domestic achievements and domestic policies have been very hit or miss, and much of his base is very unhappy with him. So I think politically this was a very risky move for Trump. I did find it very interesting, though, that the raid was largely unopposed. Now, I do understand that one of the helicopters was actually damaged, and the special forces members that actually participated in the raid to capture Maduro did take fire and did engage in several firefights. But none of the helicopters appear to have been targeted with air defense systems, manpads, the Russian and Chinese air defense systems, and anti-vehicle weapons or anti-aircraft weapons that were supplied to Venezuela. None of it was used. So I thought, well, either the United States achieved complete and total surprise, which I find that kind of hard to believe because this was a very telegraphed move. I think people were surprised that it happened, but an operation of this scale, I can't imagine the Venezuelans were completely in the dark about it, or that people within Maduro's government had been compromised and actually sold him out and allow for his capture. And it appears, based upon what members of the U.S. government are saying, that is indeed the case. There were CIA assets within Maduro's government. There seems to have been people within his administration, I'm assuming, that were probably to the point where they viewed him as a liability for their own survival politically, and that they were better off with him no longer being in power, and for the Venezuelan government to pivot towards the United States and away from Russia and China. And Russia and China did not lift a finger to stop this. I was assuming this whole time they wouldn't do it because, well, it's a very long way for either country to actually send any kind of meaningful aid to Venezuela. Russia has to cross the Atlantic, and Russia doesn't really have very many warm water ports on the Atlantic. They have one, I believe. That's Sevastopol. And they're currently tied up in a war with Ukraine. And the Chinese have to either go all the way down below South America or go through the Suez Canal. And it's a very long flight across the Pacific as well. So, again, I'm not surprised that Venezuela's two most powerful allies didn't really lift a finger. I think the assumption is that, well, Venezuela is within the U.S. sphere of influence. So whatever country is in these respective world power spheres of influence, I think is going to end up kind of being fair game. I think that's how China and Russia looked at it. Yes, sure, they're vocal supporters of the Maduro regime, but is it really worth any effort to defend Maduro's regime? Do they have any interest in having any kind of strategic foothold within South America when it's clearly considered the U.S.'s backyard? Now, people might take issue with how I'm talking about this, talking about spheres of influence, regional hegemony, great powers doing what they want, disregarding international law. Look, reality is reality, and international law honestly doesn't mean much to the great powers. It means things to states that are at a disadvantage. They can use international law to complain about the actions of their larger neighbors, or maybe try to get them sanctioned or file grievances with the UN. That's all well and good, but ultimately, at the end of the day, the world is guided and controlled by the world's major powers, and generally speaking, they are going to behave in whatever way that they see fit. Now, there's still, I think, an unspoken code of conduct between the three main powers. They're not going to target each other's leaders. I think that's something that's off limits and could lead to something extremely catastrophic, considering they all have nuclear weapons. I think direct assassinations are off the table of high-ranking personnel. Direct military action against one another outside of a proxy conflict, I think, is generally off the table, although this war in Ukraine is dancing pretty close to that. I think Western powers have done just the bare minimum to try to at least give themselves some kind of excuse to say, hey, it's not us, it's the Ukrainians. Sure, they're providing the ISR and intelligence, but it's still the Ukrainians pulling the trigger. Say, hey, don't look at us, guys. Sorry, don't be too mad at us, Russia. So, unfortunately for Venezuela, and again, people aren't going to like to hear this. I'm just being honest. Venezuela is much weaker than the United States, therefore, sort of at the mercy of the United States, especially if its larger benefactors aren't willing to actually step in and help. So I think Maduro, once the United States resolved itself, the Trump administration resolved itself to take action, there was really nothing Maduro could have done. I think he assumed Trump was bluffing, that this would be too much of a political risk for the Trump administration, and he decided to just roll the dice and be defiant. Well, I think he found out pretty quickly that the United States, being a great power and being a very powerful great power, is going to do whatever it sees fit in its strategic interests within its sphere of influence. Now, people are wondering, well, why Venezuela? Are they really trafficking drugs? Is this being done at the behest of Israel because of the opposition president saying she would move the embassy to Jerusalem? Is this just U.S. imperialism? Is this about the U.S. a continuation of the U.S.'s crusade against socialism and communism? Whatever. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I think the real reason why is because the U.S. does not want a potential outpost and friendly nation to its potential adversaries directly within its sphere of influence and close to its direct territorial waters and whatnot. And Venezuela is a fairly large country. Out of all of the countries in South America, it probably had one of the most capable militaries, and also too was openly aligned with Russia and China. Now, while the United States is not at war with Russia and China, obviously they are strategic rivals. I would say at this point, I wouldn't really call them outright adversaries. It's not like we're shooting at each other. We're still pretty diplomatic with one another. Our leaders do talk on a regular basis now. I would still consider us rivals, and I don't think the United States wanted a potential outpost for its other rivals within its sphere of influence. And also, too, yes, there are massive oil reserves under Venezuela. If the United States could tap into Venezuelan oil reserves, that would make an exit from the Middle East, I would say, much easier. The U.S. could honestly probably just care less and less about what's happening within the Middle East, especially if oil's taken off the table, and Israel can be put into a position where they'll feel comfortable enough generally on their own to deal with whatever threats that they have to deal with. I think that's why the Trump administration wants Iran neutralized so badly, so it could just wash its hands of the situation and say, okay, fine, Israel, you got everything you wanted, you're on your own, no more regional threats, have a nice day. We're going to focus on our own borders. I think that is the Middle East exit strategy. Again, people might not like to hear that. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm not saying that's a good idea. But I think that's the calculus, and that's the way they're looking at it. Now, it would appear based on Trump's statements that there isn't an intention of having some kind of occupation of Venezuela. I don't think we have the personnel for that. Venezuela is a large country with a very large population. I don't think we're sending ground troops in. What I'm assuming that the CIA did was get enough members of the Maduro government to basically take over in his absence. And now, while appearing that they didn't betray him, because members of the Maduro government can't come out and say, yeah, we worked with the CIA, we betrayed Maduro, because he still has a lot of supporters in the country. So they have to act like they're outraged at the United States. They have to act like they were taken by surprise. They have to talk tough. But I think behind the scenes, I think what's going to happen moving forward is they're going to work out a deal with the United States where they're going to end up having a direct and I wouldn't say close buddy relationship with the U.S., but they're going to pivot pretty strongly to the U.S. for their own survival. And then it leaves law and order generally intact. It leaves the infrastructure of the current governing administration intact. And it takes Maduro out of the question. Probably the most defiant member of that government is now off the table. So the United States gets not direct control over Venezuela, but very strong sway over Venezuela. without actually having to engage its troops on the ground. I think that is the calculus in what the Trump administration is actually aiming for. So I think that kind of sums up what really happened. Also, I've seen a lot of people on X talk about multipolarity, and that this is going to kill multipolarity. The U.S. is trying to maintain its hegemony over the world. This is the last gasp of a dying empire. And I would say this: I think there's a lot of naive people out there who don't really understand what multipolarity actually will look like. As U.S. hegemony recedes, major powers are going to directly and aggressively defend their interests, national interests, within their respective spheres of influence. Now that the United States is not there constantly trying to keep a lid on everything. That's why Russia has acted directly in Georgia. I think it's why Russia acted directly in Ukraine, and why it doesn't seem to fear a U.S. response at this point. Although it seems to be preparing itself for a potential conflict with NATO, mainly EU countries. I think the kind of spoken understanding between the Trump administration and Russia is, sure, this is how the world's going to be now. We do have to try to keep somewhat of a lid on this and keep the Europeans happy enough that they don't escalate this too far. But yeah, sure, have at it. We'll do enough to try to keep what's left of Ukraine afloat. But this is the way the world's going to work moving forward. It was never going to be something that was run by the UN where everyone holds hands and sings kumbaya with one another. The multipolar world is going to be an age of great powers, where smaller countries that don't play the game intelligently will probably end up facing some pretty dire consequences. Now that there's not a global hegemon there to constantly defend them and keep a lid on their larger neighbors or keep them in check. I think it wasn't really even possible for the U.S. to actually engage in that role much longer than it already had, simply because Russia and China have pretty definitively closed the technological gap. I would say China can outproduce the United States as far as military equipment and weaponry, and obviously they can put more boots on the ground, so a direct confrontation with the United States, I think, doesn't really bode well for the U.S., especially if it's a war of attrition where there's heavy losses on both sides. I think China can outlast the U.S. in that, and that Russia too, although they won't outproduce the United States industrially, I think they do have a much more experienced military than either two other great powers at this point. And I think Russia's reputation of fighting wars of attrition to the bitter end, despite heavy losses, I think makes U.S. leadership think twice about engaging in any direct conflict with Russia again, because I think I feel like I'm rambling here, but if the U.S. were to engage in any kind of direct conflict with Russia on Eastern European soil, I think the losses would be heavy enough to where it would cause some very bad political turmoil within the U.S. So I think all three main world powers have a pretty healthy respect to one another. And then also this this kind of brings Taiwan to the table. I think it's inevitable at this point, especially as multipolarity becomes the norm, that Taiwan will be returned to China one way or the other. I think the U.S. will do enough to make it look like they didn't totally abandon Taiwan, but as far as actually intervening directly to prevent a forceful capture of Taiwan by the Chinese, I don't think the United States will actually do that. I just think Taiwan's too close to China. China has too many hypersonic missiles. It would put the U.S. Pacific Fleet into too vulnerable of a position. And Taiwan is by default China anyways. People don't like to hear this too, but they're under two different political systems, but it's the same people. And I think the situation that Taiwan finds itself in is always something that was going to exist on borrowed time, one way or the other, either through force or through political developments. I think China and Taiwan will be reunited, and I don't think the United States wants to waste the time and the effort to try to keep Taiwan independent, especially if it's a losing effort. I think the United States will do everything it can to retain control of the Pacific Ocean as its backyard, but as far as actually engaging China on China's coastline, on territory that had always been traditionally Chinese and is technically still Chinese, I don't think that's that's going to happen. So again, I think if anyone thought the multipolar world was going to be, hey, what's up, buddy? Oh, that's okay. I think I need to stop and take a break too. Nice work with the Somalians in Minnesota. That whole Venezuela, what a way to show who's the boss and project force. Yeah, I think that's another reason it happened too, was to kind of show. I don't really think this was meant to show China and Russia U.S. capabilities, because I don't think China and Russia actually really feared the United States. But this was to show regional powers within the United States sphere of influence that, yes, we're very serious about our intentions, and we will use military force to bring any nation within our sphere of influence that is defiant to heel. I think that was the main reason for it. Again, like anyone who thinks that this is going to cause Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin to be fearful of like the same thing happening to them, the United States would never dare launch that kind of raid on a nuclear power. This was done because Venezuela is weak compared to the United States. Was it strong for a South American country? Absolutely. Is it weak compared to the United States? Yes. And that's something I mentioned before a little bit. If you are a regional power next to one of the world's preeminent powers, and you're in its direct sphere of influence, it is vital, paramount, that that nation has a government that is run by sensible, pragmatic people that are going to purposefully antagonize their neighbor. Because in this coming multipolar world, that is a very good way to get invaded, annexed, or face some pretty serious repercussions. Sadly with Ukraine, and this is the very bitter and ironic part about Ukraine, Ukraine could have kept itself demographically and territorially completely intact, including Crimea, if they were run by a government that had declared itself neutral, declared that they emphatically would not join NATO, and had leaned just enough to the Russians to keep them happy. They could have put themselves in a very cozy economic situation between being trading partners with the EU and Russia, getting Russian gas, imports from the EU, exporting grain. And instead, they choose to to engage in a coup and openly ally themselves with a potentially hostile power to their largest, most powerful neighbor. Stupid idea. And this is, I'd say, Maduro's position that he took, this openly defiant position, outright challenging Donald Trump to come for him, was equally stupid politically. I think if you are a smaller power next to a larger power, do not antagonize them. That is very stupid. That is a very stupid foreign policy to have. And I think that's going to cause a lot of nations, say that border, Russia, Taiwan, the United States, to think twice about doing that. I think that's going to cause the government of Mexico to maybe think twice a little bit on how it engages with the United States, and maybe not be so defiant about this issue with the drug cartels, because I think that ultimately the next target of the United States within its backyard, so to speak, is going to be the Mexican drug cartels. I will say this as an American. Targeting the drug cartels directly is not going to be an unpopular move within the United States. I personally know quite a few people, and several of my friends have died from drug overdoses, from drugs that I know damn well came up through Mexico, that are being funneled in by drug cartels. Yes, sure, there is a very large market for drugs in the United States, and that's why drugs are being shipped in. I understand that. But also, too, that if these cartels weren't allowed to exist the way that they have and become as powerful as they are, the drugs wouldn't be coming in to begin with. Okay, we used to get cocaine from Colombia, and that was about the worst thing we got. Sure, that was a nuisance. It made a lot of very vicious people very rich, caused a lot of people to, I guess, have a lot of fun in the 80s. I mean, it wasn't really laced with anything, but I mean, people were raking in billions off of it, and was making some very questionable people very, very powerful. And I think that's why, Pablo Escobar was targeted the way that he was. Not that his product was actually killing anybody, but he was amassing too much power for himself. Now, the difference is the drug cartels are shipping in stuff that's actually killing people, a lot of people. So there's not much sympathy in the United States for the Mexican government in regard to it, protecting its integrity because of the drug cartels. I think that'll be a much easier thing to sell if there is some kind of intervention against the drug cartels. I will say this, though, the drug cartels are much more powerful of a military force than some people would assume. They've actually sent people to Ukraine to get combat experience. They've been studying the use of drones in the Russia-Ukraine war. They have billions of dollars. They've amassed weaponry, anti-tank weapons, man-pads, javelins. I've even heard they've got their hands on that, 50 caliber rifles, all manner of small arms. They've basically manufactured artillery. I'm sure they have mortars. It's not going to be a walk in the park. I think this is why the Mexican government is very hesitant to actually take on the cartels, because they are a military unto themselves, probably more powerful than the actual Mexican military. So I don't think this is something that you could just send a couple Delta Force operatives in to take care of. It'll be a much more complicated and bloody thing to resolve. But I think that's probably what's next on the table. And also, as far as this being done to intimidate other countries, I think it definitely is probably also used to intimidate Mexico. This was, I'd say, a pretty clear message to Mexico as well. As far as the Minnesota thing with the Somalians, I think the Somalians have never really had a good reputation here as far as being immigrants. I think everyone has kind of known about the massive amounts of fraud. I've heard about it for a long time. I wasn't surprised. I was shocked at the level it was being done at, and I think they were getting help to do it. But I don't think they've ever really been an immigrant community that's been thought very fondly of, partly because of this. And I'm glad it's finally being dealt with. It should have been dealt with a long time ago. I think stuff like this is pretty prevalent in the United States, much more than we would like to admit. And I think, unfortunately, one of our political parties has entrenched itself so deeply within this idea that immigrants are sacrosanct, that they refuse to actually do anything about immigrants actually committing fraud, because they don't want to look like they're attacking anyone that is not a native-born American, because they've taken this position that they hold a sacred position, and this political religion of the Democratic Party. So they don't want to do anything about it, because they don't want to anger their base, because their base doesn't actually believe that immigrants commit fraud. I think they're all the most moral, wonderful people, and that everyone that comes to the United States certainly would never do anything wrong to fleece the populace for their money. But this is the real world, and that happens all the time. This is why countries generally control their immigration, to make sure they're not breaking in people that are doing this. It happens a lot. I've seen it. I've experienced it. I've gotten plenty of spam calls attempting to defraud me, people that are very good at what they're doing, that easily fool older people that I know absolutely are not weren't born and raised here in the United States. It happens a lot. It's unfortunate, but we definitely need to do something about it and assert this idea of American sovereignty and respect for the rule of law when you come to this country. I think that's key to having a country that is respected and that people don't take advantage of when they visit it. Okay, for example, when you go to Russia, do you bring drugs into Russia? No. If you do, you're stupid, because if you get caught, you're going to jail. So guess what? People generally don't bring drugs into Russia, and if you do, you're a dummy. And if you get caught, I don't feel bad for you. Don't be stupid. Saudi Arabia, same thing. When you go into these countries, you respect the local customs. They make you fearful not to. I think the United States needs to do that. Zero tolerance for fraud. Immediate deportation if you engage in it. Even if you're in the middle of like a pathway to citizenship, one crime, gone. See you. Have a nice day. Goodbye. We have to. Other nations do it. We should do it too. It absolutely needs to be done. What happens here is that a container ship will throw drugs overboard and it washes up on the beaches and up and down the coast. Hey, now just a quick question, last independent thinker. Where do most of the drugs that come into Australia actually come in from? Like what country in the region is probably the largest importer or exporter of illicit drugs to Australia? I'm just curious if you happen to know that. What I mean by multipolarity, I see this a lot on X, a lot of I guess anti-imperialist activists talk about this all the time. It's a term a lot of leftists use, but also a lot of political realists. Ever since the end of the Cold War, the U.S. has been under, or not the U.S., the world has been under U.S. hegemony. China and Russia were far too weak to challenge it in any way, shape, or form. The Soviet Union was gone, and generally most world affairs were directed or influenced by the United States of America. So the United States was the world's only existing superpower, most powerful nation. No one would dare challenge it openly. Now, while the United States still had a somewhat healthy respect for the Russian military, because of the fact that Russia had so many nukes, generally speaking, the United States is who called the shots. It was the most influential and powerful country on the planet from, I'd say, the early 1990s to I would say the beginning of the Ukraine war. I think that was probably the end of U.S. hegemony, and that's when it became obvious that the U.S. was no longer up to the task of ruling the planet. It wasn't politically popular within the United States. These adventures in the Middle East have been disastrous. There were mounting problems in the U.S., so I think the U.S. general public wanted this great experiment of having an empire to end, and for the U.S. to kind of focus on its own sphere of influence and not be involved in Europe, and not be involved in the Middle East, not be involved in Africa, not be involved in Eastern Europe, and not be involved in Southeast Asia to the extent that it had been. So multipolarity basically means that the U.S. pulls back from its hegemony, and that the world is no longer generally governed by one major superpower's political machinations, but reverts to having multiple poles of power, so to speak, that are basically calling the shots, if you will, within their respective spheres of influence. I think there's 5 countries that are considered sort of the main poles of power. I think the United States generally considers the United States, China, Russia, Japan, and India to be those central regions where political power is concentrated, where decisions that affect the entire world will be made. Those are the most powerful militaries, or countries with the most economic potential, or potentially the most powerful militaries. I think the EU is sometimes considered to be part of that, but the EU is very dysfunctional and doesn't have like an EU military. And also too, one of Europe's Achilles heels, which doesn't have the resources to maintain itself without importing a lot, especially energy and oil and whatnot. But yeah, that's multipolarity. Basically just, instead of the world being run by one superpower, it's run between the world's great powers. And while they might not directly go to war with one another, there's proxy conflicts and espionage and subterfuge happening between them all. But most countries fall within different spheres of influence, and that's who kind of guides the nations that are in those regions, pretty much. Through the ports, I'm not sure of the main source. They X-ray the containers. I'm just curious. I know the main source of drugs being imported into the United States is through South America, Central and South America, mainly Mexico. Colombia used to be one of our biggest drug importers, and that was because of the cocaine. As far as Venezuela being one of the biggest drug importers, I don't know. I haven't seen the intelligence. I think that was one of the excuses given, but I don't think it was the reason why Venezuela was attacked and Maduro was arrested. Now he's being charged with narco-terrorism, and I think several other charges that a drug trafficker would be hit with. But as far as illicit drugs being shipped through Venezuela, maybe it was one of the hubs, and maybe Maduro was making some money off of it. But the main culprit is Mexico, and has been Mexico for quite some time. The drug cartels are very good at what they do. They're very crafty, and they have a lot of connections and muscle within the United States. Generally speaking, they are fairly good at not acting out directly in the United States in a way that would inflame the public like they do in Mexico. They know they can't really get away with that here. So they generally do lay pretty low and don't kill a lot of people here in the United States. They just make sure their product gets here and is distributed. But yeah, I don't really have a whole lot else to say about what's happening in Venezuela. Hey, I got 3 people watching here now. Hi, guys. How's it going? Feel free to leave a comment. Take part here in the conversation. Uh-oh, my camera froze. Are we still good? Okay, we're still good. I thought my connection went out. I have Starlink, so thankfully my connection doesn't go out like it used to. I used to have. Hey, what's up, buddy? Uh, Amir. Hey, what's going on? Hi. Hey, good to see you. That is you, right, buddy? Yeah, Amir is my. He used to be my boss in my department at work. I'm glad you like my videos, Amir. Hello. Hey, glad you're here tonight. Yeah, I've been on here for like a half an hour just talking about what's been going on in Venezuela, my opinion on it. How you doing? Hope married life is treating you good, buddy. Thanks for being here. I appreciate it. No, I didn't see what happened in Yemen yet. I haven't really kept too many tabs on that. I'll have to look into it after I get off the video. I've been focusing mainly on what's been going on in Venezuela. That's sort of been the news of the day, so to speak. I am probably going to end this live stream here in a few. I didn't really have a whole lot else to talk about tonight. I really wanted to go over the Venezuela thing and what multipolarity is going to look like. Now, what I didn't talk about, though, is, okay, I mentioned China, Russia, the United States, Japan, India, but, who's going to be the hegemon of the Middle East? Now, Russia still has a presence in Syria, and the Syrian government wants Russia to keep a presence there as an insurance policy against Israel. Now, the new Syrian government is still in a very vulnerable position. Now, Israel wanted the last government gone, and that government was eventually ousted. Now, Bashar al-Assad is living in Moscow. Now, instead of kicking the Russians out, the new Syrian government made a very smart political move in keeping the Russians around and letting the Russians keep their bases. And this was done because at any point, if Israel decides it no longer likes the new government of Syria, then it will, again, bring its militants to bear against the new Syrian government or directly attack it. Now, if another great power that is a rival to the United States is still in the region to use its air power and prop that government up and keep its bases, well, that's good for the new Syrian government. Now, as far as who the hegemon of the Middle East is going to be, obviously the competition is currently between Iran, which is, I would say, the most powerful country in the Middle East, standing on its own without support directly from other countries, and Israel. I think Israel wants to be the hegemon of the Middle East to attempt to assure its own survival as it currently exists, and to further the greater Israel project to expand itself, expand its territory, so it's not a small strip of land the size of New Jersey with its back to the sea. I think that's Israel's ultimate plan, is to expand itself further into Syria and Lebanon and perhaps even Egypt, maybe to retake the Sinai to give themselves a larger territory. Ultimately, Israel wants the United States to stay perpetually involved in the Middle East to finally defeat their regional rival, Iran. Now, that's not a very popular thing in the United States. We don't want any more involvement directly in the Middle East. The only reason we're there is at the behest of the Israeli government. That's just the truth. So no, as far as being a hegemon, we're not talking about who's going to completely control the region. I mean, Saudi Arabia is powerful enough to stand on its own. Egypt as well. Gulf states are very rich. Iraq is still pretty dysfunctional. But as far as the two preeminent powers within the region, the two most influential, it's Iran and Israel. I think I'm not really sure. I mean, it kind of depends if the United States is willing to help Israel topple the Ayatollah and bring Iran under influence of a pro-Israel, pro-Western government. I think out of all the Middle Eastern states, I think Iran might be the most vulnerable to that. And the only reason I say that is because Iran is Persian. They're a bit different culturally than the rest of the Middle East. And being one of the largest with the most powerful military, I think it's the easiest one to potentially overthrow and turn, even though the Ayatollahs are pretty entrenched. It's going to be very difficult to remove them from power. I think that's the country that appears to be, according to the West, and I don't feel like I'm rambling here, the easiest one to topple. I think Saudi Arabia is going to do what it can to get along with, although they don't directly recognize Israel, Saudi Arabia is not going to do anything to antagonize the United States directly. Same with Qatar and these other regional countries. So as far as the future of the Middle East and what country is going to have the most power there, I don't know. I mean, that's sort of up in the air at this point. We'll see what happens. But I think I'm going to end this stream here. I've been going now for the last 40 minutes. I'm going to relax a little bit and enjoy my Saturday night. I have church pretty early in the morning. I'll be up early with the kids, so I'm not staying up too late tonight. Thanks, everybody, for showing up. Thanks for being here, Amir. I appreciate that. I'll hopefully see you at work here soon, buddy. Thanks, everyone, for showing up. I appreciate it. I'll be back next week. I always say Tuesday, but Tuesday never seems to work out. We'll shoot for Tuesday or Wednesday for another video, and I'll be doing another live stream probably next Saturday, same time. So have a good one. Good night, last independent thinker. Have a good one, and until next time. See you, everybody.